This is not engaging the youth into their future. This is some kind of weird exercise.
This is Asia News Weekly, featuring news, commentary, and analysis from the Asia-Pacific region. Thailand's junta leader continues to solidify power. Is it a good idea to lower the voting age in Japan? And get ready for more action in the South China Sea. These stories and more are coming up next on the March 13th edition of Asia News Weekly. Hello everyone, welcome to Asia News Weekly. I'm your host, Steve Miller, and I'd like to thank you for spending some time and joining me this week. We're going to go ahead and dive right into things. Our first story is from Thailand, and last year, in May, General Prayuth Chan-o-cha led a coup to overthrow the civilian government. Ever since then, there's been a lot of discussion of whether or not he wanted to retain power himself, and if civilian elections would ever return. And this week, there's actually two bits of information that actually supported the idea that he may be trying to organize a way to stay in power longer. So let's go ahead and take a quick look. First up, after the Constitutional Drafting Committee recommended banning top junta officials for 2 years from being in the government once civilian rule returned, General Prayuth shot that idea down. So that clause was pulled, instead saying that members of the Constitutional Drafting Committee should be banned, and that if junta members were, they wouldn't want to work on reforming the country. So that actual clause stuck. And that's exactly what we expect to see. Those in charge won't be allowed in the government for 2 years, but those that actually overthrew the previous government would be allowed to stay in power. Number 2 on the list, General Prayuth says, "Don't mistrust me. It," meaning the reforms, "would all end if I refuse to return power." Keep in mind, martial law is still in effect, and this is a way of him saying that he wants to keep it that way. In fact, on Monday, he said, "We ask the public to be the eyes and ears of authorities because security must come first." He said security is the only way to rebuild international trust, especially in the wake of the grenade attack last Saturday. But at what expense? Yes, you do need a strong presence to, well, make sure these kinds of horrific events don't take place. But at what price? I mean, right now in Thailand, one of the laws is that groups of 5 or more people can't congregate, can't have a discussion, can't have a public meeting, can't really march or protest. And that's a huge violation of personal freedoms. In fact, General Prayuth has come out and said that monks can't march to protest what they feel is undue scrutiny. Prayuth says, "I must say I ban any march. I will order police to prevent such activities. To the venerable, please go back to the temples." Now, this protest rally with the monks really has absolutely nothing directly to do with Prayuth or his government. It has to do with this internal matter where there are allegations of mismanagement, of embezzlement, with one of the temples that is aligned with Taskin Shinawat. So I guess there is a little bit of a loose connection there. But the way that Prayuth is really going about this is the wrong way. It really goes to show you how specifically he wants to eradicate any kind of connection from the Shinawats to Thai politics. Now, there's even growing concerns about how the reform movement, how the reforms in the legislature are moving forward. In the past 5 months, the National Legislative Assembly has passed 61 laws, things covering topics like debt collection, surrogate parenting, and flying unmanned drones. They actually have 100 more laws that are up for consideration. But critics say the laws are either in place to keep the junta in power or so poorly written they'll have to be revamped once a new government is in place. And I think that last statement is truly key. I mean, if you look at the data, the latest poll says that the majority of Thais aren't completely 100% sold on the reform process of what's being put out via press releases on what the new charter is going to contain. And that makes the entire process, well, a little suspect. It looks as if those that are charged with drafting the new constitution and revising all these laws are merely going through the motions and really trying to secure their place in the power structure. If Prayuth is serious, I've said this before and I'm going to say it again, what he truly should do is bring in outside experts. He needs to bring in people who have the legal experience of writing good laws, of drafting a constitution, and having them work side by side ties to create a new document that is uniquely Thai, that makes Thailand a true democracy. And if you don't, it truly signals your intention. If you're serious about building a new democracy, you're going to do everything in your power to make sure it happens. If you rely on people who don't have the proper expertise, it makes your motives clear, that you're not that serious about bringing democracy to Thailand. And General Prayuth, the world is watching. So my question to you is this. Given that Prayuth is the Prime Minister of Thailand, no matter what direction he ultimately goes in, whether he sets himself up to be a Prime Minister through the current avenues that he's exploring, or if a civilian government does ultimately return, we just don't know yet. But is it time for the world to recognize that he is Prime Minister, that he is the head of state, and start working with him? Coming up a little bit later, Beijing sends a clear message to Hong Kong. Last week, it was announced that both the main and opposition parties in Japan wanted to lower the voting age from 20 down to 18. It is a move that is said to possibly bring about 2.4 additional million youths into the electorate. Now, you have to ask yourself, why is this being done? Is it a good idea? And what are the ramifications of this move for not only Japan's youth, but for Japan as a whole? Now, to tackle this, to get his opinion, I'd like to welcome back Mr. Michael Cucek. He's an Adjunct Fellow at the Institute for Contemporary Asian Studies at Temple University in Japan. Mr. Cucek, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, sir.
Last year, the Diet wanted to lower the voting age from 20 down to 18, and then they were sidelined by the snap election. And now that measure is being put forward again, but the question still remains. Why do they want to lower the voting age?
You, me, and most of the Japanese public are asking the same question. What is this about? Why are we doing this? And if we're doing it, why are we only doing it for a referendum for the Constitution? Which, by the way, has never been held. They've never even tried to do this yet. So even before they've even run a test run using the electorate that we already have, they're putting in 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds. And frankly, all the explanations that are put out by the LDP, because this is an LDP bill, even though it's sponsored by all of the major parties, with the exception of the communists, all the parties are agreeing to it, because who wants to be against extending the vote to young people? You know, it's like being against rice. You know, you won't see parties voting against it. But fundamentally, what's the purpose of giving high schoolers or persons right out of high schools the right to vote? Is a question that's just boggling most people's minds.
Is this, in, I guess, a way of putting it, is this redefining adulthood in Japan by lowering this voting age to 18?
It certainly is. In Japan, under the common law, under the civil code, you can live apart from your parents from the age of 15 on, just after you finish middle school. But you are considered a minor until you're 20 years of age. At 20, you become not only a voter, but you can drink legally. It's actually a huge transition, and we even have a national holiday, which is January this 10th or someday around then, called Seijin no Hi, which is the day when persons turning 20 during the year celebrate this transformation, and it's a national holiday. This undermines this basic concept that you turn an adult at 20, and everyone's saying, what's the purpose?
So, given this move, given this change, do you think that the government will be successful in implementing it to whatever end goal they have?
Yeah, well, they've given a hint. The LDP let the other shoe drop last week, at the end of the week, when they began talking, at least at the Policy Research Council president, Ms. Inada Tomomi, and others in the party began suddenly, out of the blue, talking about, well, if we're going to lower the voting age, doesn't that mean that these people are now adults? And if they're adults, then they're adults under the law. And in Japan, persons who commit crimes who are under 20 years of age are tried as minors. This puts Japan in something of a special category. Internationally, we have in many countries people as young as 16 being tried as adults. But here in Japan, until you're 20, you can't be tried as an adult. For the first time last week, the LDP began talking. And now people are saying, this is what it's always been about. This is what they were always thinking in the background. And it's something that they've been thinking about for a long time. And if you haven't been in Japan for many years, you would be confused. But if you could remember back to the first Abe administration, 7 years ago, at that time, they were talking about the introduction of moral education into the curriculum of elementary and high school and middle schools, because we wanted to create a society where children do not kill their parents. The number of crimes committed by children against their parents, at least minor children against their parents, is minuscule in this country. And it seemed a really bizarre obsession. But now we seem to be seeing the reemergence of this obsession. In truth, the real crimes of children against parents is elder abuse by adults who are beating up their usually senile parents, taking their money, incarcerating them. These are the real crimes that are going on. But inside the imaginations of certain members of the ruling party, the really heinous crimes is minor children killing their parents, and that this, if it's not dealt with, will be the end of Japanese civilization.
Oh, very interesting. Now, one last question, and this is really speaking to the broader issue. Is Japan's youth ready for this shift? Are they ready for the added responsibility?
Absolutely not. In the last election, the election that was held in this last December, fewer than a third of voters 20 to 29 years of age showed up at the polls. It was 32.5% or something like that, an incredibly small number. So what you're going to be doing is adding 2 million extra names to the voters' rolls and hoping that 600,000 people show up. This is not engaging the youth in their future. This is some kind of weird exercise. And it seems to be that the real goal all along has been the transformation of the definition of childhood downward, so that you can try 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds as adults, and in theory, execute them under the statutes that currently exist.
Wow, a lot of information there. Michael Cucek, again, thank you so much for taking the time this week to join us on the podcast.
Always a pleasure.
You've heard Mr. Cucek's comments on this issue, and now I'd like to hear from you. What do you think about lowering the voting age from 20 down to 18? Is Japan's youth population ready for adulthood, ready for the responsibility of being part of the electorate? Please leave your thoughts in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. Now, coming up a little bit later in the podcast, China's President Xi on military spending and the South China Sea. China's parliament has essentially dealt a death blow to Hong Kong's democratic movement. China's chief parliament chief announced last weekend that its ruling last year on screening candidates who want to run for election as Hong Kong's top official in 2017 was the correct one, striking home the point the central government wasn't going to back down on its decision and set off 2 months of protests last year. Zhang, who heads the parliament, said the decision has important meaning for the management of the one country, two systems policy and promoting the gradual development of democracy and the smooth carrying out of the 2017 chief executive election by universal suffrage. And that is really the core of the issue, the definition of universal suffrage. The United Kingdom is continuously trying to press the call for open elections, just like Hong Kongers want. They want to be able to freely nominate and elect whoever they choose, not to have some central committee choose candidates which will presumably be pro-Beijing and then be forced to pick the lesser of two evils, which in many ways is democracy all over the world. China is offering a vote. So in its mind, it says it's upholding its end of the handover agreement. The UK doesn't see it that way, voicing concern over how Hong Kong is being managed, even going as far as to say that personal freedoms are being eroded. Acknowledging the British Parliament couldn't force change in China, Richard Onaway said, quote, "It's almost advice to China from a country that's had a democracy for hundreds of years, that if you offer the people a bit of democracy, they're going to want the whole lot, and that until they get a complete package of democracy, this is going to be a continuing problem for them." And he's absolutely right. This is something that many analysts have also said around the globe, that the Chinese government is deathly afraid of true democracy taking root anywhere under its realm. But as 2017 approaches, we have to keep an eye on the situation, because even now, we have student activists going back out into the streets asking for democracy. And as that election for that chief executive nears, we'll probably see it once more. And who knows what that protest will look like. It could have, potentially, disastrous results. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Beijing is very capable and truly wants to play the long game. Hong Kongers need to look at the situation. They need to change their tactics and figure out how to beat their system at its own game. However that will be, well, it's anybody's guess, but it certainly is worth watching. What else is taking place in the region? Well, coming up in just a few minutes, some other stories you might have missed. Ever since we saw China unveil the 9-dash line, that territorial marker that, well, as they say, gives them historical justification that most of the South China Sea belongs to them, we've seen the nation take a more aggressive stance. And two pieces of information came to light this week that bear watching. First, the more alarming of the two, China's Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, defended his government's reclamation of land on the disputed isles in the South China Sea. Wang said China was undertaking, quote, necessary construction that was not aimed at any third party, adding, "We are not like some countries, which have carried out illegal building in other people's homes, and we won't accept unwarranted remarks about work on our own home." And second, Chen Zhao, a research fellow at the Academy of Military Sciences affiliated with the People's Liberation Army and a deputy to the National People's Congress, said China's defense spending was appropriate and rational. Now, all of this gives very clear clues as to what China's endgame is. Don't believe me? Check this out. Just recently, Lei Luangmin, ASEAN Secretary General, said that the ASEAN Group rejects China's policy of using the dotted line to assert its sovereignty over myriad islets and reefs in the sea. China responded by shutting him down and saying ASEAN wasn't party to the South China Sea disputes. And that is exactly what this is all about. It's about China seeking control of the region. Not necessarily just being able to brag that it has the largest geographic area, but it's about controlling the natural resources within the South China Sea. Don't forget, below the surface, we're talking fishing, natural gas, oil, and of course those very lucrative shipping lanes. No one is able to stand up to China, and no one probably will. After all, no one stepped in to stop Russia from going into Ukraine and annexing Crimea. China knows that if they follow this very slow, methodical encroachment into the area where there are territorial disputes, it may go unnoticed, despite being in clear violation of UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on Law of the Seas. But the more we delay, the more we risk China being able to establish a strong foothold. We already see that on some of these reefs, they're fortifying their position with anti-aircraft installations. And if they establish a strong fortified foothold, it's going to be pretty hard to remove them, if not impossible. So the question I have for you is, what is the world going to do? Do we take action now, or do we wait until China actually has the ability to defend the 9-dash line? Don't forget, we also have another podcast that comes out every Wednesday. It's called Asia Now and features stories and interviews from this particular part of the region. This week on that podcast, I sat down with two individuals who left North America to come to Asia and start businesses. It is time to round out the podcast, so here are a few additional stories worth keeping an eye on. First, authorities in China are warning that the H7N9 avian flu has the potential to become a worldwide pandemic. Thus far, it's infected roughly 650 people, mainly in China. About 40% of those have died from the flu, but at that time they also suffered from other medical problems. Research published in the journal Nature noted that this flu has evolved and exchanged genetic material with the H9N2 virus that spreads fairly easily from person to person. Now, hopefully this will not be as bad as some people are predicting, but one thing we have to keep in mind, health officials around the world are always warning us that a global pandemic is just around the corner. We saw it many years ago with swine flu, SARS, avian flu, just recently with Ebola. And thankfully, our health organizations have always stepped up to the plate and taken care of it. But there is a danger that we may start ignoring that and think of these warnings as essentially the boy calling wolf. Next up, this week at the UN Commission on the Status of Women, South Korea's Gender Equality and Family Minister, Kim Hee-jung, urged Japan to face up to history and resolve the issue of sexual enslavement of women during World War II. It was the first time for Seoul to address the matter at this particular panel. Quote, "I am encouraged to see how much progress has been made around the world in securing greater safety for women, but no such progress has been made regarding the thousands of women who were forced into sexual slavery during World War II. Kim also added, "What our government is demanding is that Japan acknowledge its past misconduct, make a sincere apology, and provide correct history education for future generations, so that this will not occur again." And I have to say kudos for the minister for stepping up and saying this. But one thing still bothers me, and this is the notion that many people have brought up before. specifically with South Korea, specifically also with China. And that's the call for Japan to make a sincere apology. In my opinion, that's really not specific enough. What kind of apology are you truly asking for? What information needs to be said in that apology for you to accept it? Until that happens, you're never going to be satisfied. Japan, if it chooses to issue an apology, is never going to know what it needs to say. And in all honesty, right now with Abe and his cronies, you're never going to get that apology. They don't view this as something that they need to apologize for. The government says back in 1965 when the bilateral treaty came about, they apologized, and that was the end of it. So what South Korea and China really need to do at this point is just say their piece, as in this instance, and walk away, and wait for a time when a new administration in Japan would actually be more receptive to be moving forward on this issue. In Myanmar, or sometimes called Burma, Human Rights Watch urged authorities to rein in police after clashes with student protesters. On March 10th, police backed by local plainclothes police auxiliaries used batons to violently disperse an estimated 200 student demonstrators near the town of Papandan. Brian Adams, Asia Director for Human Rights Watch, said the savage beating of students by police and plainclothes thugs marks an ugly return to the street violence of military rule. The government needs to rein in abusive police, disband unaccountable auxiliaries, and permit peaceful demonstrations. The next story comes from the China Daily, so keep in mind it's going to have a little bit of a spin. Zhang Chunxian, top official from China's Xinjiang Uyghur region, says some Xinjiang residents have crossed the border illegally to join the Islamic State. The group currently has a growing international influence, and Xinjiang is affected by it too. Okay, here's the deal. Yes, some Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region have carried out what I would call terrorist attacks. And yes, Uyghurs are Muslim, but trying to link them to Daesh, I think, is going just a bit too far. And one final story here. Japan's Nikkei newspaper reported last week that Japan and North Korea may resume talks on kidnapped Japanese citizens. Japanese and North Korean diplomats in China met informally in late February and agreed to hold a meeting sometime in late March or early April. This also comes on the heels of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in North Korea, Marzuki Darusman, urging the United Nations to hold the DPRK accountable for abducting foreign nationals. I know this is a huge deal for Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. But truthfully, I just don't see these negotiations with North Korea going anywhere. And with the UN calling for greater accountability, that doesn't make much of a difference as well. Well, my friends, here we are, the end of the podcast. And before I go, I do need to give some thanks to my Patreon supporters. This month, I'd like to thank Brayhawk Technology, Eric Engel, Robert Brooker, Daniel Tudor, Tim Maloney, Christopher Wenninger, Hiko Simon, Victor, and R. Wiseman. Thank you so much for your financial contributions to help Asia News Weekly keep on going. And if you'd like to help Asia News Weekly, you can learn more by going to our website or going over to patreon.com/Asia News Weekly. And as my special thanks for you and anyone else who ever wants to donate to the show, every Sunday I try to release an exclusive podcast, a news story that's happening in the news that I don't cover on the Asia Brief, Asia Now, or Asia News Weekly. It's something exclusive for the Patreon supporters. So take a look at it if it interests you, but don't worry. These podcasts will always remain free. Now, of course, you left some amazing comments on the Asia Brief, on Asia Now, and of course, Asia News Weekly over the past week. So let's take a quick look at some of those. First up, from Ricardo Avellino on Asia Now. I always find it interesting, the mix of Catholicism, Buddhism, and Aboriginal beliefs that my family still hold dear. Thanks for sharing. Christopher Mast from an Asia Now podcast also says, all white for a year? Wow, that's hardcore. I was like 7 when I saw my first dead person, my grandmother, in a casket. Very surreal. Ricky de la Herria asked me, what do you think South Korea and its allies should do with the North? And really the short answer is recognize that the current system isn't working. I believe South Korea and the United Nations need to take a harder line with aid and actually perhaps think about withholding it. They need to work harder to build a two-state system. 69 Phuket says this on the MH370 flight. Flight 370 did not end up in the ocean. It was hacked and flown to a, quote, facility. And one last comment from Shanghai Noon. Most foreigners don't understand. We will move on when Japan finally moves on, because at the moment, they are still talking about it. As always, those are some amazing comments, and I truly do value the time it takes to leave them. So thank you so much. Also, there was an awesome, truly awesome, lively discussion on Twitter between Dimitri Perrin and Jim Mullins about capital punishment and what it means for society. It was great. So thank you guys for doing that as well. All right, that's all the time I have. But before I go, please, if you have a thought about one of the stories mentioned in this week's show, please take a moment and leave a comment or share it on Facebook or Twitter. Be sure to follow Asia News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter for more news from the region. You can also send an email to the show with your questions, your feedback, and your comments. Just drop a line to podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends, and while you're at it, subscribe. You can do that on our website, asiannewsweekly.net. Just click the tab at the top that says subscribe, or you can follow a link to your favorite application. Subscribing is free, and when you do that, next episode is delivered automatically to you. Well, my friends, thank you so much for joining me. I'll be back on Monday with the Asia Brief. And until next time, I'm Steve Miller reminding you to be true to yourself and always be awesome.